The map changed, and most people did not even notice when it happened. In the space of 2 weeks, somewhere in the muddy fields of southern Ukraine, across a battle space the size of a small European country, a military operation unfolded that shattered assumptions held by strategists in Washington, Moscow, and Brussels. 300 square kilometers of territory reclaimed. An entire Russian battalion, not weakened, not scattered, but destroyed as a coherent fighting force. Ballistic missile factories burning inside Russia, hundreds of kilometers from the front. The skies over Moscow temporarily closed by Ukrainian drones. And a new missile, built in secret under constant bombardment, that can reach from the Dnipro River to the Ural Mountains. That is not a summary of a year of fighting. That is a summary of a single week. And if you think you understand this war, what you are about to hear will make you reconsider everything. To understand why this week was different, you need to understand the weight of what came before it. For months, the narrative dominating Western media had settled into a kind of exhausted fatalism. Ukraine was holding on. Russia was grinding. The lines were not moving. There were voices in Washington and European capitals suggesting that Ukraine should consider what kind of settlement it might accept. The word negotiation was appearing more frequently in the same sentences as the words territorial concession. Into that atmosphere, into that heavy political moment, Ukraine launched something that nobody in the Kremlin's war rooms had prepared for. Not one operation, not a limited push in one sector. A simultaneous, multi-front, multi-domain offensive cascade designed not just to take ground, but to break Russia's decision-making capacity across every layer of the conflict at once. What military theorists call multi-domain convergence. What the soldiers who executed it would probably call something far less academic. The ignition point was Zaporizhia, the southern front, and the chain reaction that started there is what everyone needs to understand first. Over the 2 weeks leading up to late February 2026, Ukrainian armed forces liberated dozens of villages across the Zaporizhia region. Each settlement that changed hands represented the collapse of a Russian defensive position that Moscow had spent months fortifying. But here is what made this counteroffensive fundamentally different from the grinding attritional advances the world had grown accustomed to watching. The breakthrough did not come from one direction. Ukrainian forces advanced northwest of Verbov. They reduced Russian pressure around Stepov. They liberated 8 more settlements along the Oleksandrivka axis. And then Ukrainian units began pushing toward the village of Kalenki, initiating direct clashes with Russian defenders who had believed themselves to be secure. This entire cascade of simultaneous movement was confirmed by the Institute for the Study of War, by the Ukrainian General Staff, by multiple open-source intelligence analysts, and by international media. Geolocated footage, satellite imagery, local testimonies, all of it converged on the same conclusion. Russia's defensive architecture in the south was cracking. Now let the numbers land, because numbers matter. Maps published by ISW showed Ukrainian-controlled territory expanding to cover Verbov, Kopani, Nova, and Kalenki. The total area of gains acknowledged by President Zelensky reached approximately 300 square kilometers. 300 square kilometers in 2 weeks. Think about that for a moment, because the scale of it carries an extraordinary historical echo. Remember Ukraine's Kursk incursion in the summer of 2024? In the first week of that operation, Ukrainian forces seized roughly 250 to 300 square kilometers of Russian territory inside Russia itself. The kind of advance that stunned international observers and forced an emergency response from the Kremlin. The same scale of movement that shocked the world when it happened inside Russia is now being replicated inside Russia's own occupation zone in southern Ukraine. But this time, it is Russian defensive lines that are collapsing. The roles have reversed. The map is blue where Moscow thought it was red. And this is not improvisation or luck. It is the product of a deliberate, layered operational strategy designed weeks in advance and executed with a level of coordination that only becomes visible when you step back and see the full picture. Defense Forces spokesperson Vladislav Voloshin described the mechanics with careful precision. Ukrainian troops were carrying out counterattacks and offensive actions across the entire Zaporizhia region simultaneously. Control was re-established in multiple settlements along the border zone between the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups were cleared. The gray zones were shrinking. This was orchestrated. And behind the visible advances on the southern front was a force that international coverage consistently underestimates. The Ukrainian Air Assault Forces, Ukraine's airborne elite, officially confirmed a major ongoing offensive along the Oleksandrivka axis. The operation was led by Air Assault Forces Commander General Ola Apostle, and it included two of Ukraine's most decorated brigades, the 82nd Bukovina and the 95th Airborne, both operating at an extremely high operational tempo. The battlefield was described by commanders as, in their own words, extremely dynamic. Despite intense Russian resistance and the emergency deployment of significant enemy reserves thrown into the breach, Ukraine's paratroopers maintained the initiative. They repelled Russian counterattacks. They kept advancing. This was not a one-time push followed by a pause. This was sustained elite pressure against an enemy already pulling reserves from other sectors to plug holes that kept reopening. And that thinning of Russian reserves is itself one of the most strategically significant developments of this entire phase. According to ISW analysis from February 2026, the reserves of Russia's western grouping of forces had been funneled north to contain Ukrainian counterattacks near Kupiansk, leaving them unavailable to reinforce operations in the south. Ukraine was pulling Russia's forces in two directions at once, forcing impossible choices between sectors, creating the very vulnerabilities that Ukrainian commanders were designed to exploit. This is operational art at its most sophisticated. The Spartan Brigade, a National Guard unit operating inside Zaporizhia Oblast, delivered a precision strike on a Russian military convoy along a key logistical route. The Russians had been improvising in the way forces under constant pressure always do, attaching weapon systems to pickup trucks and ATVs. The convoy was moving. The Spartan Brigade hit it on the road. The entire column was destroyed before it reached its destination. One operation, one convoy, 0 survivors. These are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a Russian army running dangerously low on both equipment and cohesion on the southern axis. And then came the cold accounting from Ukraine's Alpha Special Forces. In just 1 week on the southern front alone, 3 tanks for armored vehicles, 16 artillery systems for multiple rocket launchers, 3 air defense systems, 231 vehicles, 227 drones, for ammunition depots, for fuel depots, and more than 2,000 Russian soldiers removed from the battlefield. That is not a setback for Russia's southern campaign. That is a catastrophe for its ability to project force in this theater. If you have been following this war with us and you want to make sure you never miss an analysis like this one, now is the moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit subscribe, enable notifications, and join a community that takes geopolitics seriously. What is unfolding right now is moving faster than the mainstream news cycle can track. We break it down here, every development, every strategic shift, every implication. Now let us get back to the story, because we have only covered the ground war. What happened in the air and deep inside Russian territory is where this week truly became historic. The fire that started in Zaporizhia did not stay there. When it reached the Kupiansk front, roughly 300 kilometers to the north, it produced one of the most stunning single tactical results of the entire war. Ukrainian forces advanced toward Vovchansk, isolated, and completely destroyed an entire Russian battalion. Not degraded, not forced to retreat. Destroyed as a coherent fighting unit. Joint Forces Task Force spokesman Viktor Tertyakov delivered the assessment with cold precision. Russian forces in Kupiansk, he stated, controlled less than 3% of the city. Only a few dozen soldiers remained, sheltering in scattered buildings. These men were not fighting to advance. They were surviving, trapped north and east of Kupiansk beyond the Oskil River with no realistic means of reinforcement or extraction. SW confirmed Ukrainian advances near both Kupiansk and Oleksandrivka in its February 23, 2026 assessment. And here is the detail that tells you everything about Russian command and control. Russian military bloggers, typically deeply reluctant to admit bad news, were publicly criticizing their own command for filing false reports about seized territory. When the people inside your own information ecosystem are calling out your lies, propaganda can no longer conceal what the battlefield already made obvious. Then came the Flamingo. That is the name Ukraine gave its new long-range strike missile, developed in secret, assembled under constant Russian bombardment, tested in conditions no conventional defense procurement program would ever survive. In the week we are analyzing, the Flamingo announced itself to the world in the most dramatic way possible. Ukrainian forces struck the Votkinsk plant in the Udmurt Republic, more than 2,400 kilometers from the front line. The Votkinsk plant is not a peripheral target. It is one of the core nodes of Russia's strategic weapons production infrastructure, a facility linked to ballistic missile production, including the Iskander and potentially components related to the Orshnik. The hypersonic weapon Putin has spent years presenting as the ultimate expression of Russian invulnerability. In one strike, Ukraine demonstrated that no factory in Russia, no matter how far from the border, no matter how deep in the industrial heartland, is beyond reach. That is a strategic statement of the highest order. And it came from a missile Ukraine built itself. The same week, Ukrainian drones penetrated Moscow's airspace. Domodedovo Airport was temporarily closed as Russian air defenses scrambled. This is Moscow. This is the symbolic center of the Russian state, the city that Putin's military was supposed to keep immune from the consequences of a war he chose to start. Temporary closure of Moscow's airspace is not just a military event. It is a psychological rupture in the narrative the Kremlin has been selling its own population for more than 4 years. In Saratov, 2 Ka-52 attack helicopters were destroyed on the ground at a Russian Aerospace Forces base. The Ka-52 is one of Russia's most capable attack rotorcraft. Ukraine reached into Russia's deep rear and eliminated 2 of them before they could fly a single sortie. In Belgorod, the Frenzivska electrical substation was struck. Widespread power outages followed across surrounding settlements and Belgorod city itself. In the Fur region, satellite imagery confirmed the destruction of a workshop at a chemical plant producing lubricants for the Russian Ministry of Defense. Russia was being struck simultaneously in its occupied territories, its border regions, its energy infrastructure, its military-industrial complex, and its capital's airspace. And here is a factor that most coverage missed entirely. SpaceX, working with Ukraine's defense ministry, implemented a whitelist system that cut off Russian forces' unauthorized use of Starlink terminals as of February 1, 2026. Russian forces had been mounting Starlink receivers on attack drones to extend their range and precision. That capability was eliminated. The timing of Ukraine's multi-front offensive push, beginning in the days immediately after that cutoff, was not coincidental. Ukraine struck harder, faster, and deeper the moment Russia's drone networks went partially blind. Now look at this from the Kremlin's perspective, because the view from Moscow has never been darker. 300 square kilometers lost in the south. A strategic city being effectively recaptured in the north. Ballistic missile factories burning in the Ural Mountains. Helicopter bases struck hundreds of kilometers behind the front. Moscow's airspace temporarily closed. And here is the number that should alarm Russia's war planners most of all. According to ISW's February 15th assessment, Russian weekly territorial gains peaked at 141 square kilometers in late January 2026. By the week of February 8th through 14th, those gains had already fallen to just 74 square kilometers, almost halved, and this collapse happened before Ukraine's major counteroffensive moves were fully consolidated. The momentum had shifted before the world noticed it had shifted. Russia is spending enormous resources to advance at walking pace through fields and tiny villages. Ukraine is spending those same resources to hit the factories that build the weapons Russia uses to do that walking. The cost-exchange ratio of this war just changed. Zelensky was direct when speaking to Tagesspiegel on February 23rd. Ukraine will continue developing the Flamingo. Ukraine will continue building its military-industrial capacity. He also addressed the Orshnik directly, the hypersonic weapon Putin launched at Dnipro in November 2024 as a demonstration of what he called unstoppable Russian power. Zelensky stated that Russia currently has 3 Orshnik systems deployed. He stated that Ukraine can see them. Ukraine is working on the problem. Think about what that implies. The weapon Putin used to intimidate not just Ukraine, but the entire Western alliance is now a system that Ukraine tracks, targets, and is actively developing countermeasures against. Ukraine already struck its development range at Kapustin Yar in January. The Votkinsk plant was struck in February. Russia's most fearsome weapon is on Ukraine's targeting list. The final truth that the view from the Kremlin makes undeniable is this. A war that Russia began believing it would win in 72 hours, a war it has now been fighting for more than 4 years against a country it tried to erase from the map, has produced something no one in Moscow's strategic planning apparatus anticipated. The country they tried to erase built its own cruise missiles in secret. It assembled its own drone armies under constant bombardment. It trained airborne assault forces that are now executing operations comparable to elite units of the world's most advanced militaries. And it is striking targets so deep inside Russia that Soviet-era defense planners would have considered them invulnerable. Russia did not simply fail to win quickly. Through its own choices, through the war it chose to fight, it created the conditions for its own long-term strategic erosion. The fire started in Zaporizhia. It is spreading. And the world's understanding of what this war has become is changing faster than the news cycle can capture. What do you think? Is Ukraine approaching a genuine strategic inflection point in this conflict, or are there factors that could reverse this momentum before it fully consolidates? Drop your analysis in the comments below. This conversation is worth having.